Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. This video pertains primarily to ham radio operators, so those of you who routinely turn in here and are not affiliated with the amateur radio service, you may want to skip this video. But today we're going to talk about pecuniary interests. I'll have more in just a moment. One of the things that lawyers always recommend is that you do what you can to reduce your level of risk, meaning you reduce your risks in terms of any kind of legal complication that comes from your behavior. So, for example, when people are driving, we tell them to drive the speed limit. That way they don't, get a ticket. We obviously can help fix that afterwards. We can go to court and defend, but it's much better not to have to defend in the first place. So we try and tell people to stay within the limits of the law. The law in some respects is very clear. A speed limit sign that says 45 miles an hour is very clear. However, a regulation that says you can't transmit for pecuniary interest is somewhat vague. I have been told by a couple of people that there are individuals who are upset that YouTube channels are essentially monetizing the amateur radio service. Now, let me get my bias out of the way before we begin here. My bias is that anybody who puts out content on YouTube that helps me become a better amateur radio operator and in the process is compensated for that activity through YouTube, that to me is a public service, and I don't see that the FCC would be particularly upset about it. But here's the thing you have to remember about federal bureaus, federal agents, and bureaucratic institutions in general. What you think and what you believe may not figure into their calculus when they start looking at things. So today we're going to look at Part 97 and the regulations that deal with, specifically with pecuniary interest and transmission for compensation, because that's essentially what's being alleged. That when somebody gets on YouTube and says, I'm going to do a POTA activation on Monday, March 1st, and if you manage to catch me on the POTA activation, you'll probably wind up on my video, that is essentially monetizing the amateur radio operation at the POTA for YouTube likes and obviously monetization of the YouTube channel. So let's look at that and let's see if we can figure a few things out based on the plain language of the regulations. Now, the statute does not appear to say anything about the pecuniary interest. It just establishes the FCC. The FCC, however, has written in the Code of Regulations, Part 97, the rules governing the amateur service, and there are several things that are of note. The first is the definition of the amateur radio service. It says, a radio communication service for the purpose of self-training, intercommunication, and technical investigations carried out by amateurs, that is, duly authorized persons interested in radio technique solely with a personal aim and without pecuniary interest. Now, it's interesting that they go to all this trouble to define what the amateur radio service is, but they don't define anywhere in these regulations what a pecuniary interest is. So when a regulation uses a term that is a term of art, like, for example, technical investigations or intercommunication. Those are sort of technical terms, and the technical meaning applies. Otherwise, the dictionary definition applies. So what is the dictionary definition of pecuniary interest? Well, here is the definition of pecuniary. Here's what the dictionary says. Pecuniary is consisting of or measured in money, or of relating to money. So a pecuniary interest is an interest, basically, in money. Interesting how when even you apply the definition, the term itself is not very clear. Maybe the regulations can give us some clarity. Let's look at those. So the regulations then go on to describe what transmissions are prohibited in the amateur service. And that's at part 97.113. And the first one says, no amateur radio station shall transmit communications specifically prohibited elsewhere in this part. And 2, communications for hire for material compensation, direct or indirect, paid or promised, except as otherwise provided in these rules. And this is the other portion of the regulation. It says communications in which a station licensee or control operator has a pecuniary interest, including communications on behalf of employees, with the following exceptions. And the exceptions here are not relevant. So, one of the things that lawyers know that I think most people don't understand about the law is that when the law uses these terms like direct or indirect, paid or promised, in kind or in cash, they use them in the sense that any action that falls under those is prohibited. So when it says direct or indirect material compensation, the key term is material, not compensation. It has to be a material element of compensation flowing directly from a prohibited transmission. Now, there is a way to get there in some respects. So, let's take the issue that we talked about just a moment ago with regard to a POTA activation. And I'm going to single out K8MRV here because I know Huntsville State Park now better than any other state park in the country because Mike is transmitted from underneath every tree there. But let's suppose that he went on the air and said, I'm going to be doing this POTA activation, and I really need you to contact me on this POTA activation so that I can get a whole lot of likes on my YouTube channel. Now, I don't think Mike is silly enough to do that, but if he did that and then conducted this radio operation, he might very well run afoul of this, not in terms of direct compensation, but in terms of indirect compensation, meaning his transmissions at the park were indirectly related to his attempt to monetize his YouTube channel. And so when we have situations like this, we look at other statutes and other acts that have analogous language, and we look at the enforcement actions that are taken underneath those statutes. One of those is called the anti-kickback statute, and it talks about compensation for physicians that is paid in cash or in kind. Well, in kind can mean gift cards. It can mean even things like a reduction in rent. And so the breadth of that means that you have to be very careful about deriving compensation from the transmissions. Now, you can derive compensation from the YouTube channel all day long, talking about amateur radio. That's fine. But where you tend to run into trouble is where you use the amateur radio transmissions to direct people to the YouTube channel or to direct them to a website for commercial gain, or to your merchandise on your website, or to your merchandise on your YouTube channel. All of these things can produce a number of problems for you down the road. Now, does that mean that the FCC is sitting there waiting for someone to file a complaint so they can come pounce on you? Probably not. But it might mean you could get a warning letter from them if you did this with regularity. Now, another situation that has been called to my attention is a video where a ham recorded another ham, Josh Noss from Ham Radio Crash Course, talking about the Ham Radio Crash Course on the air. And because the Ham Radio Crash Course is monetized, because it has a bunch of subscribers, because it's monetized, it might be thought of as those radio transmissions directing someone to the Ham Radio Crash Course for the direct pecuniary gain of Noss. Again, I think that's a stretch, and I think most people have a realistic and reasonable understanding of what goes on with YouTube content providers, which is specifically that they do their work to enhance the hobby, to enhance the amateur radio service, not specifically to make money. I think if you look at the content on HRCC, and I think if you look at the HRCC podcast, which is one of the funniest podcasts out there, I think if you look at this, you understand that they're all about the community. They're about basically getting information in and out to other amateur radios or amateur radio operators. And I think that in that situation, while they may derive income from Patreon and they may derive income from YouTube, and all of those things are certainly direct compensation, they're not direct compensation for the transmissions, and it's the transmissions that the FCC is most concerned about. So if I were advising a ham radio operator, and of course I'm not because I don't have a lawyer-client relationship with any of them, and I could only advise with respect to Missouri because that's where I'm licensed to practice. But if I was, what I would advise is that you don't make any link on the air between anything you do on YouTube and what you do on your amateur radio station. Again, all of these folks, all of these content providers, KB9VBR, Josh Noss at Ham Radio Crash Course, K8MRD, Mike, Jason, Ham Radio 2.0, Temporarily Offline, Ham Radio Dude, all these folks are about making the service more approachable for people who may not have a technical background, like I didn't. I mean, I came to this from the field of law. I think that's as far away from amateur radio as you can be. And they do it with the aim of making it a more enjoyable hobby. And ultimately, that benefits everybody. And not just amateur radio operators, but everybody, the public in general. Because when there is an emergency and ham radio operators go to work on that emergency, that is a public service. So, again, I'm not offering legal advice here, but I think that the concern about defeating a pecuniary interest needs to focus specifically on the transmission. And if you're not transmitting information that says, hey, come to my YouTube channel, come to my website, come buy my merchandise, then I think in most cases you're probably going to be okay. But if you get a warning letter or a letter requesting information from the FCC, do not stop and do not pass go. Don't collect $200. Go immediately to an attorney and have them address it, because you do not want to leave the FCC hanging. Again, that is the kind of thing that gets you sometimes severe sanctions. So, if you have any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. If you haven't already, I'd love it if you'd go over here and subscribe to the channel. And if you would, leave me a thumbs up to let everybody know that this was useful and valuable content. Thank you again for watching. Have a terrific day.